Thank you for joining us. My name is Mia Burke, and I work as program manager with Hanford Challenge. Hanford Challenge is a nonprofit that is based in Seattle, and we advocate for a safe and effective cleanup of the Hanford nuclear site. And one of the things that makes us unique and is the most important cornerstone of our work is our support of workers on the front lines of cleanup. This is the 28th webinar of our Nuclear Waste Scholar Series. If you're new to the series, we started it to inspire action and involvement with Hanford Cleanup by inviting speakers to share groundbreaking scholarship, art, research, and experience working with nuclear waste. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers, Clara Duffy and Zoe Ragen. Clara is the board president for the Women's Institute for Solidarity and Empowerment, also known as WISE. And Zoe is the research team lead for WISE. WISE is a community resource organization focused on putting research tools and methods into the hands of women that are most impacted. WISE provides resources to and works with communities and grassroots organizations representing working and marginalized women in developing qualitative and community-based research that they can use to share their unbiased stories and bolster their movements. They'll be talking more about their work with you today. Just as a heads up, the presentation will be about 45 minutes long, and if you can't stick around for the whole time, feel free to leave. We will be recording the presentation and we'll share a link of the recording with everyone that registered. Thank you so much for joining us today, Clara and Zoe. I'll pass it to you to talk about your work.
Hello, everyone. I am Clara. I am the board president with the Women's Institute for Solidarity and Empowerment. And Zoe and I work together on this presentation to really show the impacts and resistance strategies of women in the interactions with the nuclear supply chain. And so our presentation is called Radioactive Links, Connections Between Women Impacted by Nuclear around the Globe. And we will go into a couple different aspects. So we'll look first at who we are, the two of us, and why are we talking about this today. And then we will go into some specifics around what is the global situation today and why is the threat of war so present, and specifically nuclear war. And then we'll look at the impacts to women at the different points of the nuclear supply chain. So anywhere from mining to production to testing to cleanup. And then we'll look at the different strategies and work that the women and communities are doing in order to try to resist the global institution of nuclear war production. And at this point, also nuclear energy, which is also having some negative impacts on communities. For today, we got a bit of an introduction into what our organization is. WISE does have 5 priority research areas. We have them all listed on our website, so I encourage folks to check it out. Our website is wiseresearch.org. And the primary one that we'll be referencing today and kind of explaining through this presentation is the area around anti-people governance and forms of systemic violence. So as we go through the presentation today, we'll show you all how governmental priorities and corporate interests around militarism, specifically in this case around nuclear defense and energy, are anti-people in nature and have violent impacts on vulnerable populations all around the world. So just taking a closer look at that. And for our overall method as an organization, we are, like we said earlier, a research institute and resource center. Our organization is fairly new. We were formed as a like state nonprofit in 2021 and then received our 501c3 status in 2023. Our work really centers around partnering with grassroots women's organizations and working in marginalized women to share and popularize their campaigns for rights and welfare. And so we have a particular method in how we do this. Um, we use a method called participatory action research. And in our case, we ensure that our method is women centered throughout the process. So we don't do these research projects for the communities. We really partner with the communities from start to finish to develop the questions that they want to answer, which is this like little diagram that it's showing for our method. So we start with like developing, asking, and answering questions, um, and then specifically looking into what conditions and problems we want to understand, and that we do that in partnership with the communities so we can ensure that they are the product, whatever we produce, really can be used by the community itself. Um, and then we work with them to analyze and collaboratively identify trends, determine solutions to the problems, and assess the research. So, if anything is not working at that point, the community can help us figure out how we can adjust the project to ensure that whatever we are working on collectively, it can adjust to meet their needs. And then that process kind of goes on in different ways. And it's not necessarily linear throughout this. But there is also a component of action. So our method is not just for creating like some sort like a paper that potentially doesn't end up in the hands of the communities to be able to use to advance their campaigns, but we have a specific objective to ensure that anything that we produce is either popularizing people's campaigns or um, like strategically used in the campaigns that people are engaging in. We ensure that once the problem and the solution are determined through the research, we determine what is the action that we want to call for the community to take alongside the communities that are engaging in the project. Um, and specifically, these actions are usually actions that these groups are already taking or engaging in. And the research that is put out there, the research that they develop is from information that they're already gathering within their communities. We believe that grassroots organizations really have the knowledge that institutions typically gather through these research projects, but we believe that the communities really have this information already through their work on the ground. And we're just working with them to really build it out and put it in a format that can be shared and popularized. In a lot of ways, we help with capacity building for grassroots movements. But yeah, a lot of different products can be made. We aren't a traditional research institution, so we don't just do peer-reviewed papers. Some potential products are data sets, recipes, blog posts, zines, pamphlets, documentary videos, paper articles, books. And also we've done like mapping in the past. So yeah, that overall is our method. A lot of the work that you'll see today is really coming from organizations and movements on the ground in the research that we're putting forward here. hopefully throughout we'll be able to highlight the different organizations that folks should follow and plug into. And today, in the development of this, we are collaborating with Resist US Led War Seattle. So I will pass it to Zoe to explain more about Resist.
Thanks, Clara. So, like Clara was saying, we partner very closely and consciously with grassroots organizations and community members. One of these grassroots organizations that we are partnering with is Resist US Led War Seattle. And there's a committee within the organization called the Women's Desk that we are partnering with particularly for this project. Resist US Led War Seattle, as it says on here, it's a grassroots organization with two aims. The first is to resist US-led war and militarism in all its manifestations. So that includes like nuclear arms buildup, but it also includes like economic sanctions, things like that. And the second aim is to build a just peace. So trying to forge bonds of solidarity and advance causes of social equity and justice around the world. Right now, Resist's main campaign is demanding that the University of Washington cut ties with Boeing for its war profiteering and weapons production, including its involvement in all three legs of the nuclear triad of the US military. And within Resist, a committee that we are working particularly with is the Women's Desk, which is a group of people within the organization that focuses on developing and propagating an analysis of the intersections of war and militarism with gender, and sees the root causes of violence against women as situated within an increasing crisis that are fueled by war and militarism around the world. And thus, we often see women and gender oppressed peoples leading the fight against the expansion of aggressive wars. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about why are we focusing so much, particularly on women, despite, even though our name is the Women's Institute for Solidarity and Empowerment. Just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what are the particular impacts of violence against women, particularly when we're thinking about war, militarism, and nuclear. So just in general, 1 in 3 women will experience domestic and or intimate partner violence in their lives. And that's around the world on average. But in colonized nations, this number is more like 2 in 3 women who will experience domestic and or intimate partner violence. I'm just gonna kind of go through this, but 80% of people displaced globally by climate change are women. This is also linked to militarism. The US military is the #1 institutional polluter when it comes to greenhouse gases. And so climate change really is an issue that's linked very closely to war. 60% of chronically hungry people are women and girls. Military conflict and climate change are 2 of the largest global drivers of food insecurity. So this kind of nuclear arms race, this global geopolitical posturing that occurs, it's women and girls who are caught in the crosshairs often. And while men are more likely than women to die in armed combat, women and children are actually exponentially more likely to die from the indirect impacts of war, such as starvation or malnutrition, displacement, lack of healthcare access, or heightened rates of human trafficking, just to name a few impacts. And related to the very first point on this slide, right, militarism and war drastically increase rates of sexual violence wherever there are boots on the ground. So if we'll go to the next slide. This is the analysis that's coming to us from the Resist US Led War Women's Desk. And they're really seeing that the development of women's oppression and gendered oppression has not always looked the way that it does today, right? There are often, even today, we see a lot of indigenous societies that are more matrilineal than patrilineal. But in general, the way that gendered oppression has developed is it has developed alongside society's progression into class-based society and class oppression. And these global crises that are fueled by the constant expansion of our capitalist economy that is growing and kind of putting its tentacles all over the world. And we see in the US, we often have I think we've all experienced these like booms and busts of our economic system. But the way that the economic system crawls up out of those busts is by kind of offloading the economic crisis, onto colonies and semi-colonies, different countries that are subjugated by the US military around the world. And that really puts women all around the world at an increased risk for violence. And so when we're talking about imperialism, what I'm referring to really is the highest stage of capitalism. So this economic system that we are living in, corporations need to grow. They need to create a return on investments for their shareholders quarter after quarter. Otherwise, the corporation will go bankrupt, right? So this is actually a system that's built on exponential growth, situated in a planet that has finite limits. So it's also the system that's based deeply on the theft of resources from other nations, which really leads to the impoverishment of the majority of humanity, especially in those global South nations, where backed by the military, Western-based corporations will go in and find very cheap resources and very cheap labor. And that actually does play out as war. So from the Women's Desk's analysis, to actually move towards gender liberation and liberation for women, the fight must be actually against the entire system of expansionist economies. And so it's a fight against imperialism and its manifestations of economic exploitation and militarism. And so on the next slide, what we're going to get into now is a little bit of an overview of the world geopolitical situation. We're all aware we're living under the second Trump administration. And there's been quite a lot of posturing, not just under Trump, but under his predecessor as well, around saying, the US is to prepare to go to war with China. And so we're going to talk through a little bit the kind of US national security strategy. And I'm going to just take a moment here and give a definition for what we're talking about when we mention militarism. So what this is referring to is any use of force, harassment, military aid, arms, and then wars of aggression by powerful elites in the world. And by elites, we're talking about politicians, governments, military alliances, like the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, like the AUKUS Trilateral Security Pact, even the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which actually requires all of its member countries to spend about 2% of their GDP on the military, or Article 5 of NATO states that if any one country of NATO is involved in a war, then all of the other members must come to the aid. So you can see there's these cascading effects of being involved in military alliances. Elites also includes corporations, armed forces, right-wing extremist groups, paramilitary groups, and any other power holders. And we're seeing a ramping up of militarism as there's a lot of saber rattling occurring around the world right now. Global military spending increased by 9.8% in 2024. So globally, we're seeing a new high of $2.46 trillion going towards militarism. And the biggest military spenders were the US by far, which I'll get into a little bit more in just a minute here, but also China and Russia. And these three countries together account for over half of global arms expenditures. And they have the three largest defense budgets in the world. And right now, what we're seeing is currently we're in this era of what's been dubbed a pivot to Asia. And so we're really seeing these major military assets building up across the Asia Pacific. But let's talk a little bit more on the next slide about where the US military is around the world. So perhaps you've seen a figure like this before. This is just a map from David Vine of all of the different US military bases that are abroad as of 2020. So there are over 800 extraterritorial United States military bases around the world. And this is a conservative estimate by the State Department's own reporting. We kind of combed through some of their reports. The military actually owns over 4,500 different real estate holdings outside of the US around the world. And another reason why we care so much about war and militarism as a women's organization is that war impacts not just those who are soldiers, right? Anywhere that there are US military bases, there are also elevated risks and rates of gender-based and sexual violence. So this is extraterritorially. So we see the popping up of red light districts around, for instance, the Clark Air Base in the Philippines, where there are reports of a lot of mixed race children to single mothers who are forced into the sex work trade because there are not a lot of other options due to the subjugation of the entire economy by the presence of the US military in different bases in the Philippines. But we see that at home too, at places like the Joint Base Lewis McChord. There are escalated levels of sexual violence around the base, but also on the base, as well as severe underreporting of this kind of harassment and violence towards women. There are also, however, always people, often women, resisting militarism wherever it is. So throughout this presentation, we'll be talking about and highlighting that resistance as well. And on the next slide, we're just going to take another little look at what militarism concretely looks like. And maybe you've heard this figure before as well, that the United States spends more on defense than the next largest spenders on their militaries combined. And this has been true my entire life. Year after year, the US military spends more than the next 9 or 10 nations combined. And I think this is really interesting. And we can see the way that, so the US has its military bases all around the world, and it spends so much money on its military. And this is all to serve several primary goals. The first really is to orient global economic flows around the US. So ensuring that there are resources and supply chains set up for US-based corporations. The second really is to posture against geopolitical rivals. And primarily what you'll see in both the Biden Defense National Strategy, as well as Project 2025, is the naming of these 3 main enemies of the United States, China, Russia, and Iran. And the third is really to repress people's liberation movements in different nations that are colonies or semi-colonies of the United States. And despite this gigantic, trillion-dollar military budget, the US still has some kind of a underdog mentality when it comes to its military. So, it's the largest and most well-funded military in the world, but it continues to spend more on defense year after year, saying we have to catch up, we have to modernize, we're falling behind Russia and China. And this spending is occurring at the expense of social services like education and healthcare. So on the next slide, I mentioned this drive to modernize. And what we're seeing right now is, in particular, a drive to modernizing the nuclear arsenal of the United States. So there have been a pledge of $1.7 trillion over the next 30 years that the US is projected to spend as it expands its nuclear arsenal as part of this new nuclear arms race against China, Russia, and Iran primarily. And just to put this amount of money in context, the Manhattan Project, so that first project to create the first atomic bomb, cost around $30 billion adjusted for inflation over the course of World War II. With this new plan of modernizing the nuclear arsenal, the United States is actually on pace to spend nearly double that amount every single year for the next 30 years. This is a map that I threw in here. It's actually from a great article that was recently published in the New York Times, showing some of the different sites of militarism. WISE is based in Seattle, which is only about 18 miles away as the crow flies from the naval base Kitsap, which is the site up in the, up in Washington State in the Pacific Northwest here. And just again, to put this amount of money in context, $1.7 trillion is also the amount of total student debt in the US. So if we just think about it for a moment, this $1.7 trillion, if it weren't going towards nuclear weapons modernization, it could relieve everybody who has student debt in the United States. This is money that could go towards housing, education, environmental remediation, and so much more. But instead, we see actually where the US government's priorities truly are. So as we move forward into talking more specifically about women and the nuclear supply chain, we wanted to take a moment and kind of let the emotional side of nuclear war, nuclear testing, and nuclear buildup kind of sink in for a moment. So what we have up next for you is a poem from a Marshallese poet. And we'll talk more about it in just a moment, but the Marshall Islands are the site of a lot of nuclear weapons testing by the US military. And so I'll let Kathy speak for herself, but just as a heads up, and I think, we've already kind of jumped into discussing some of the sexual violence and domestic violence that we are going to be covering in this, but the video itself also does talk about miscarriage and death. So just as a heads up before we take a look and listen. So Kathy Jetnil-Kildner is a Marshallese poet and activist who has been really vocal about the lasting impacts of nuclear testing on Marshallese Islanders and women in particular.
Hi, my name is Kathy Jetnil-Kildner, and I'm a poet from the Marshall Islands. I wanted to share with you all my latest poem, which was written in support of a conference that's going on right now, in which countries around the world are discussing a treaty to ban nuclear weapons. As a Marshallese, I, of course, am in full support of this ban. The Marshall Islands was the site of over 60 nuclear weapons being detonated during the US nuclear weapons testing program. And that has totally wreaked havoc on our environment, on our island, and our health and our people. And so this poem was written specifically in support of that conference, but it also focuses mainly on the experiences of the women who were affected by the radiation. These women had to deal with a lot of birth defects and birth abnormalities, giving birth to things like jellyfish baby, what they call jellyfish babies, or babies, with no bones, really horrific, traumatic things. And so this poem is really a meditation on those experiences of those women. But I'm also wanted to add that I'm shooting this poem here in Hiroshima in front of one of the buildings that's one of the only surviving buildings that survived the blast from the Hiroshima bomb. And I think this is a really, this is kind of a really important place to perform this piece, because I see so many connections between the experiences of the Marshallese people and the Japanese people, and especially the women who had to bear the burden of the trauma that came with birth defects and birth abnormalities. So here's the piece. Sometimes I wonder if Marshallese women are the chosen ones. If someone selected us out from a stack, drew us out slow, methodical, then issued the order. Give birth to nightmares. Show the world what happens when the sun explodes inside you. How many stories of nuclear war are hidden in our bodies? 574. The number of stillbirths and miscarriages after the bombs of 1951, before the bombs? 52. Bella Cambodge told the UN she could no longer have children, that she saw her friends give birth to ugly things. Nere gave birth to something resembling the eggs of a sea turtle, and Flora gave birth to something like the intestines. She told this to a committee of men who washed their hands of their sin, these women who bore unholy things, and how these women buried their nightmares beneath a coconut tree, pretended it never happened. Sinister, hideous, monster, more jellyfish than child. And yet they could see the chest inhale, exhale. Could it be human? Nere gave birth to something resembling the eggs of a sea turtle, and Flora gave birth to something like the intestines. In Marshallese legends lives a monster called a Medenaguat. Women demons, unhinged jaws, swallowing canoes, men whole. Shark teeth in the backs of their head. Necks that stretch around an entire island, bloodthirsty, hungry for pregnant women and babies. Monsters. My 3-year-old likes to hunt for monsters in our closet. We use the light of my cell phone, a blue glow in the dark. We whisper to each other, did you hear that? Did I hear what? Nere gave birth to something resembling the eggs of a sea turtle, and Flora gave birth to something like the intestines. The silence of my dreams is severed by her screaming nightmares, and I am a mewling mess turned monster, huddled in the corner, wide-eyed, wild-haired, unable to touch, unable to bear the exhaustion, pain, and anxiety clawing away at my chest. Am I even human? Postpartum, easier to diagnose after the fact, 2 years later, and those memories still haunt me. When I became the bump in the night, when I realized I needed to protect her from me. Did you hear that? Nere gave birth to something resembling the eggs of a sea turtle, and Flora gave birth to something like the intestines. In legends lives a monster, women demons, unhinged jaws, swallowing their own babies, driven mad, turned flesh rotten, blood through their eyes, their teeth, their nose, were the women who gave birth to nightmares, considered monsters. Were they driven mad by these unholy things that came from their bodies? Were they sick with the feeling of horror that perhaps there was something wrong with them? My 3-year-old sleeps next to me. I have lost my fangs and ugly dreams. I watch her chest inhale, exhale, know that she is real, she is mine. I try to write forgiveness and healing into our story, into myself. In legends lives a woman, turned monster from loneliness, turned monster from agony and suns exploding in her chest. She gives birth to a child that is not so much a child, but too much a jellyfish. Struggling for breath, struggling in pain. She wants to bring the child peace. She wants to bring the child home, her first home inside her body. It is an embrace. It is only an embrace. She kneels next to the child and she inhales.
Thank you for listening to that. I think it's really powerful and important to bring in the experience of the women who are really on the ground.
We are getting into the portion now on the nuclear supply chain and women's connection to it, or the impact on women. We're going to start with mining, which is usually where the nuclear supply chain will begin. One of the main trends for communities that are impacted by mining or have mining in their areas are the generations of contamination and what that looks like for the communities themselves. So it was discovered in 1958 that women are actually twice as sensitive to radiation as men, and it was a doctor who found out that children whose mothers had been x-rayed during pregnancies were twice as likely to suffer from leukemia as other children. Thinking about this also in relation to where mining usually happens. And in the places where these minerals are found are usually in sovereign nations or indigenous communities where they are living on lands and their ancestral lands are rich in natural resources. And so indigenous women are particularly affected because some of the reservations are home to uranium specifically, and then there are other natural resources that are in other reservations and ancestral lands. So specifically, one of the major places in the US that has been resisting uranium mining and transport is the Navajo Nation. And about a quarter of Navajo women and some infants who were part of this federally funded study, were found to have high levels of radioactive metal in their systems decades after the mining for the Cold War ended on the reservation. There are about 500 abandoned mines on the Navajo Nation alone. Something that was found with this study is that the women's levels were actually higher, that were found in their systems were actually higher than that of like the top 5% of people. So yeah, just understanding the people in the close vicinities to these uranium mines, especially women, will experience lasting impacts of just existing in those areas.
2/3 of the uranium for the Manhattan Project came from the Shinkolobwe mine in the Congo, which, when these deposits are found abroad, especially in colonial nations, as we were talking at the start of this, there is military occupation in those areas to ensure that the resources are brought to the Western corporations or governments where they are manufactured. So another instance of escalated violence through that militarism. And then, the uranium is brought then to a production facility. And of course, we know well the Hanford site, right? That's one of the main places where plutonium was produced for the 60,000 American nuclear weapons built during the Cold War. And, it's also thanks to the Hanford Challenge that we know a lot about the government neglect and actual cover up of the amount of radioactive material that was released. This is actually one of the most contaminated places in the US as well. And we have heard stories of women who worked at Hanford during this time. There actually wasn't personal protective equipment that was suited for their bodies. And so women were often wearing PPE that was meant for men. And so it was ill-fitting and probably not protecting them as well as it should have been. They would also hide their pregnancies to continue going into work because as working class women, they really needed to continue to get a paycheck and support their families. And at that time, only 25% of workers at Hanford were women across all of the different fields. In the region, also, neonatal and infant death was 20% higher than the national average during Hanford's operation. And this is generally because the radioactive materials, they impact women very, very heavily and then also very easily enter the bodies of the fetuses that they're carrying. Another location that was part of the nuclear production in the US was the Pantex plant that's down in Texas. And again, about a quarter of the workers there were women. And a report that came out about the health impacts of the workers at that plant showed that The women working there very commonly experienced issues with pregnancy and childbirth. And the women who worked there experienced cancer, lung, and heart issues at higher rates than the men.
You know, with all of the production, especially in the Cold War era, and periods since then, there has been different testing that has happened, as well as just full-blown detonation of nuclear bombs. This really causes a lot of disruption, obviously, to the communities, and sometimes making the communities unlivable. So particularly, there's a strong case in the Marshall Islands, which is what Kathy was talking about in the video that we saw. And the U.S. conducted 67 nuclear tests on the Marshall Islands. And originally, the U.S. government relocated only 167 residents from the area where they were going to conduct testing. And that was out of a population of 56,000 at that point. Today, there are 47,300 Marshallese living in diaspora, and then a population of like even less than the original amount prior to the testing of 54,296 in the Marshall Islands itself. So we just see that the impact on the communities themselves extends beyond just like the issues of communities that remain in the area, what we've been talking about in terms of the health impacts and the lasting issues connected to radiation in like food systems and water systems, but also for the people that are forced to leave their homelands and what that means in terms of their need to assimilate and adjust to a new environment, and also just the pain of having to be separate from your homeland and home country. And then also specifically in relation to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, there were 270,000 people that survived the first 5 months after the bombs and became known as hibakusha. And the hibakusha were also forcibly displaced and settled in atomic slums and experienced years of deprivation and isolation. And this also included like experiencing the impacts of being a foreigner in another area. So they were experiencing racism and things like that. But even still, they said what was worse was like living with the fear of forever having to live with the impacts of the amount of radiation that they were exposed to. And what would that mean for their families and their communities in general? Yes. And then another aspect in terms of the testing and detonation is generational trauma and loss of sovereignty. So overall, the Marshall Islands gained sovereignty, quote unquote sovereignty, in 1986, but the U.S. retains full authority and responsibility for the security and defense matters in or relating to the Marshall Islands, including the right to use Marshallese lands and waters for military activities. The Marshall Islands are essentially dependent on outside aid, and they primarily get their aid from organizations like the World Bank and donor countries like the US and Australia, which accounts for more than 25% of its gross domestic product. And these external funders are able to then exert outsized control over the development agendas of the nations that they support. So then they have a say in what are the climate change adaptations that are appropriate. And for the Marshall Islands to, given that it's suffering under the conditions of climate change right now and the sea levels are rising, And the community is worried about it being submerged, essentially, all of their homelands. There has been like a quoted plan of how they could save their communities, and it's around, I think, 1 billion or something to do that. But that the Marshall Islands as a nation itself does not have the ability to decide to make those climate adaptations. And because of the dependence on outside funders, a lot of these proposals, when they do try to bring them, are only for like very small projects that aren't able to sustainably address the situation. In Greenland, during the Cold War, there was an underground city that was built and then abandoned, and it was buried underneath the ice sheets. And so in the abandonment, they left behind 9,200 tons of physical waste, which is just like leftover building infrastructure, 200,000 liters of diesel fuel, and 24 million liters of biological waste, and then 1.2 trillion BQ, which is a unit of radioactivity, of radioactive material. So something that's also concerning to Greenland is the fact that climate change is affecting them as well and melting the ice sheets. So that radiation is frozen underneath the ice sheets right now, but as climate change continues to impact the community, they continue to risk the radiation being exposed and then impacting the communities overall, having pretty much the same impact that's being experienced on the Marshall Islands right now. Yeah, and there will be a video at the end of this section where Kathy actually joins up with an organizer from Greenland and a poet, and explains kind of the relationships between the two struggles. But we'll go to the cleanup.
So the cleanup of radioactive materials is, as you probably are aware, it's very difficult. It's dangerous, it's time consuming, and it's very expensive. So, you know, at Hanford, for instance, you know, for the over 40 years of its operations, that radioactive waste from the plutonium processing was pumped into, I think, something like 177 underground storage tanks on the site. And each of those tanks has just a toxic sludge of and liquids and solids. And researchers have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to treat and store the waste in a safe manner, because, like we've been discussing this whole time, radioactive waste has immense health impacts and environmental impacts. The tank cleanup is already, you know, way behind schedule, as we might expect, and it's also way over budget. So it's expected to take another 60 years and cost as much as $550 billion. And the government had projected that it would be done already. However, it's not. There's a lot more to do, and along the way, workers have continuously been falling ill from the chemical vapors that are escaping the tanks and the ground. And the government continues to evade responsibility. Generally, what we see is at these different environmental remediation and cleanup sites, women are leading the charge and pushing for the efforts, particularly in Indigenous communities. And we'll talk more, we'll close out with that focus on who those women are. So we'll just go to the next slide and kind of zoom out. So we've been looking at each piece of the nuclear supply chain, but can we just kind of make one cohesive picture for ourselves? This right here is a map of the US nuclear weapons complex at the end of the Cold War. So each of these different decals is indicating a site along the US nuclear weapons complex, from mining, which you can see with these black like mining carts sort of scattered throughout the center of the country, and especially in Navajo Nation land, through the production. Particularly, we talked about Hanford and we talked about the Pantex plant down in Texas. The testing sites in Nevada, in Alaskan Islands, and then the Marshall Islands, all the way to deployment. But of course, this doesn't just exist within the United States. So on the next page, I'm just including this beautiful graphic from actually a previous Hanford Scholar Series speaker. This is a beautiful art print showing the trajectory of the uranium mined at the Shinkolobwe mine in the Congo, how it went to Europe, how it went to the US, and how it was involved in different processes to make the nuclear weapons before being tested at various different sites in the US and in colonial holdings of the US before ultimately being deployed during warfare in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So just wanting to orient us to the fact that this is really a global supply chain. And in this new nuclear buildup, what we're likely to see is another global nuclear supply chain.
The artist's name is Roger Pete, just so everyone knows.
Thank you. It's Roger Pete. Yeah, it's really incredible. So we'll now go back to Kathy and hear a poem that's more of a call to action.
Sister of ice and snow, I'm coming to you from the land of my ancestors, from atolls, sunken volcanoes, undersea descent of sleeping giants.
Sister of ocean and sand, I welcome you to the land of my ancestors, to the land where they sacrificed their lives to make mine possible, to the land of survivors.
I'm coming to you from the land my ancestors chose, Nailungainan, Marshall Islands, a country more sea than land.
I welcome you to Gadashiklunan, Greenland, the biggest island on earth.
With me, I bring these shells that I picked from the shores of Bikini Atoll and Runit Dome.
In my hand, I hold these rocks, picked from the shores of North, the foundation of the land I call my home.
These shells I bring with me a story of long ago. Two sisters frozen in time on the island of Biyay. One magically turned to stone, the other who chose that life to be rooted by her sister's side. To this day, the two sisters can be seen by the edge of the reef, a lesson in permanence.
With these rocks I bring a story told countless times, a story about Sister Ma'amna, mother of the sea, who lives in a cave at the bottom of the ocean. This is a story about the guardian of the sea. She sees the greed in our hearts, the disrespect in our eyes. Every whale, every stream, every iceberg are her children. When we disrespect them, she gives us what we deserve, a lesson in respect. Do we deserve the melting ice, the hungry polar bears coming to our islands, or the colossal icebergs hitting these waters with rage? From one island to another,
I ask for solutions. From one island to another,
I ask for your problems.
let me show you the tide, coming for us faster than we'd like to admit. Let me show you airports underwater, bulldoze reefs, blasted salmons, and plans to build new atolls, forcing land from an ancient rising sea, forcing us to imagine turning ourselves to stone.
Can you see a glacier's grown the weight of the world's heat? The weight here on the land of my ancestors, hard heavy with a continuous thirst for solutions. And to watch this land change while the world remains silent.
Sister of ice and snow, I come to you now. Reef,
Morning landscapes that are always forced to change. First, through walls inflicted on us,
then through nuclear waste dumped in our waters,
on our ice, Now, this sister of ocean and sand, I offer you these rocks, the foundation of my home. May the same unshakable foundation connect us, make us stronger than these colonizing monsters that still to this day devour our lives. The very same beasts that now decide you should live, you should die.
Sister of ice and snow, I offer you these shells and the story of the two sisters as testament, as declaration that despite what we are told, we will not leave. We choose stone. We will choose to be rooted to this reef forever. From these islands,
We ask for solutions.
from these islands,
We ask, we demand, the world see beyond.
easy. Their pre-packaged convenience, their royal slick trees,
Beyond the belief that tomorrow will never happen, and this is merely an inconvenient truth.
let me bring my home to yours.
Let's watch as Miami, New York, Shanghai, Amsterdam, London, Rio de Janeiro, and Osaka try to be under one. For your home fall beneath nights.
We have years, we have months before you sacrifice us again, before you watch from your TV screens and computer screens, see if we will still be breathing while you living.
Sister, also these rocks, it's a reminder that our lives and more than their power. Life in our form demands the same respect we all give to life.
And these issues will affect each and every one of us. None of us is immune.
Each one of us is decided if we will rise.
So I hope that was inspiring and also sobering. It was for me when I watched it as well. I think this at this point we are just going through what this means for our future, what our group's already doing to try to address these issues that we have been pulling out throughout the course of this presentation. And so just to show, we kind of spoke about this a little bit through the video. We could see this in action as well. But in terms of the mining, the indigenous tribes that live on the ancestral lands or are attempting to defend and their ancestral lands are on the front lines of this movement. So in Alaska, in this photo here, this is the Inupiat village that is being affected by the uranium mining. In Arizona, it's actually difficult now in Arizona because there has been the tribal on the tribal lands of the Navajo Nation. There was like collective resistance to the transportation of uranium through their lands. But actually recently, the tribal government agreed to, I think it was in March, that they agreed to a deal with the shipping company Energy Fuels to now allow them to resume the uranium transport on their lands. So this woman in this photo is one of the indigenous leaders in a group that's called Hall No, and they are fighting against this the decision, specifically citing the impacts to the health of the community members as well as the environmental degradation that are consequences of even transporting the uranium in their area. And then this photo is a woman that is speaking from the Ute tribe in Utah. And also seeing the links with like the transport and the mining itself through a lot of different communities across the United States. and across the world overall. And so many of these vulnerable populations are affected and already don't have resources to get their basic needs met, and still at the same time are fiercely fighting in defense of their land and their sovereignty and the health of their communities. Then there's also continued resistance to the production. Recently, it's really in the form of nuclear power plants. That's like starting to be a resurgence of nuclear production. So in Japan, we see that this organization, Numenren, is an organization of family farmers in Japan, and they are protesting the reopening of the power plants and wanting to ensure the protection of their territories. In Kenya, there are groups that are trying to protect their environment. So it was like a lot of environmental groups that were participating in the protests, and the things that they're citing as the negative effects will be similar to what Kathy was talking about in the first poem, is the malformed children born because of the radiation poisoning to the women, and fish dying. And then in Tucson, just highlighting that this is not the solution. Like a nuclear power plant is not the solution to green energy, and specifically saying that like it's been proven that this type of energy is too expensive, risky, and slow to actually make a difference in the future energy needs. And it'll also not be in the interest of consumers. So even though that's like what is being shared, that it will be in people's interest to like ensure that they get lower bills, it'll likely raise the bills over time. And then in Minneapolis, there's a coalition for a nuclear-free Mississippi River, which demanded the energy company to keep its 2030 shutdown date for the Monticello nuclear reactor because of the serious threats that it posed to public health and the Mississippi River and drinking water for millions of people in the area. Kind of just a similar situation happening in India that's similar to what is being talked about in the other areas as well. But I will go now to the resistance to testing, detonation, and cleanup, and Zoe can share about these.
So this is really, we're wrapping it up here and including some calls to action for folks, but also just, you know, drawing inspiration continuously from the women who are always on the front lines along the whole supply chain and along the whole history of nuclear weapons development and testing, as well as now the nuclear energy production, which still has really large like health and environmental impacts on people as it moves forward. So just in the top left corner here is a photo of a chieftain from the Marshall Islands, Dorothy Kahua, who was always advocating for her people and actually went to the UN to push for like basically healthcare and essentially reparations for her people. Following along in her legacy are the Aboriginal women in Australia. Right now, most of the world's uranium is coming from Aboriginal land in Australia. So again, this through line of Indigenous women, Indigenous lands, really being on the front lines of the destruction for this kind of technology and development. This is something that we need to be continuously pushing back against and growing a people's movement and bringing in more people to understand the issues of nuclear weapons production and testing, as well as just the really hazardous waste that's produced and how we don't actually have ways of remediating it well or disposing of it well, even for nuclear energy. Just wanted to spotlight this organization Just Moms, who are based in St. Louis, and they've been for answers from the government about why it's been permissible for there to be these dumping grounds of nuclear waste in the suburbs of St. Louis, and the public has just not been informed of them whatsoever. So just, there's this long legacy of resistance to draw from, and I think that brings us into just the end of our presentation to do today, where on the next slide we have some specific calls to action for people on this call here and to share with people in your communities. We wanted to share, WISE Research is always looking to partner with other community organizations or folks on the ground. You can always donate, and you can find information about how to sign up for our newsletter at our website, wiseresearch.org/get-involved. We're on Instagram. If you're on Instagram, we'd love to connect with you there at wise_research. And you can always reach out to us via email as well. So info@wiseresearch.org. We'd love to hear your stories. If you have any experiences along any point in the chain of the nuclear supply chain, we are really interested to hear from you. We wanted to plug Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action. They are commemorating Mother's Day, a day before Mother's Day on May 10th. If people are in the Seattle area at all, they're just on the fence line of the Kitsap Banger base. So they have property right next to one of the largest nuclear weapons arsenals in the world. And the reason why they have a big Mother's Day action is because actually the history of Mother's Day is mothers coming together to protest like war and nuclear weapons in support of their sons who were being drafted. So continuing that history of Mother's Day. And if you'd like to get involved with some community work, we have some ongoing feminist participatory action research that you can be a part of. We're always looking for volunteers. Right now, our main project is looking at the drivers of forced migration and how migrant women in the Seattle area are fighting for better rights and conditions for their communities, which is particularly important right now as migrant communities are very much under attack by the Trump administration. So you can learn more about that at this website here, tinyurl.com/inthekitchen2025. And there's also going to be, I know International Women's Day is March 8th, but we're going to be doing a belated Women's Day event honoring the traditions of migrant women. So some of the women who have been participating in our project, the In the Kitchen project, which is about sharing stories of forced migration and sharing cultural, like things of cultural importance to these women, are going to be hosting an event that we're helping them put on. Thank you everybody for coming and listening.